We're going to look at how the murder of Emmett Till, contributed to the civil rights movement. Now, Emmett Till was born in 1941, and his birth coincides with a sociological study that was performed. The results of the study were released shortly after Emmett's birth, and essentially, the study looked at miscegenation. And white Southerners were asked what they believed Blacks most wanted from integration. And their number one response was that Blacks wanted interracial marriage and sexual intercourse with whites. So that was their number one response. Whereas when Blacks were asked that question, that was the very last category that they ranked. So whites and Blacks are on two different ends of the spectrum when it came to the responses of this study. Shortly after Emmett's birth, his parents separated, and in 1943, Emmett's father, Lewis, was drafted into World War II. In 1945, Emmett's mother, Mamie, learned that that Lewis died in Europe during World War II. She wasn't given many details of Lewis's death, but she was given one of his few possessions, which was a ring, and it had his initials inscribed in the ring, LT for Lewis Till. Historically, in 1948, you have a new political party that was forming, the Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats were split from the Mississippi. They were a branch of the Mississippi Democratic Party. And this was a pro Southern party that believed in states' rights, but among other things, they were against any empowerment for African Americans and also integration. They felt that the Democratic president, Harry Truman, was far too liberal with African Americans. The States' Rights Party, or the Dixiecrats, nominated their own presidential candidate, who was the governor of South Carolina. His name was Strom Thurmond. And Thurmond carried four states, which gave him 39 electoral votes. Not nearly enough for the presidency, and Truman went on to win the presidency in 1948. On May 17th, 1954, one of the Supreme Court's most famous decisions, what we call a landmark decision, was issued. The Supreme Court ordered public schools desegregated in this Brown versus the Board of Education decision. The watershed case overturned that whole separate but equal clause that was given in Plessy versus Ferguson. If you recall, that Supreme Court decision was from 1896, in which the Supreme Court said that Blacks and whites could be separate as long as their accommodations were equal. Southern segregationists vowed to oppose this ruling, and they labeled this day Black Monday. Mississippi Circuit Court Judge Tom Brady became the intellectual godfather of the Mississippi Citizens Council, which was a white supremacist organization. The first meeting that it held was in Indianola, Mississippi on July 11th. So, July 11th, 1954 is when this group first met. Almost a year later, on May 7th, 1955, this gentleman, George W. Lee, was murdered. His George Washington Lee. He was a grocery owner and a member of the NAACP. He worked as a field worker for the NAACP. He was shot and killed at point blank range while driving in his car after he tried to vote. And a few weeks later, in Brookhaven, Mississippi, Lamar Smith, another African American man, was shot and killed in front of the county courthouse. This happened in broad daylight before witnesses because he had just cast his ballot. So he came out from voting and was murdered in front of a crowd in broad daylight. Both victims had been active in voter registration drives for all African Americans in the South, and no one was ever going to be arrested in connection with either murder. Later that summer, Mamie Till rushed her son Emmett, who was going to visit relatives in Mississippi. So she rushes him to the train station in Chicago. He caught the southbound train to Money, Mississippi. He was going to be visiting his uncle. Now, prior to him going on this trip, his mother, so just the day before, had given him his father's ring. So that ring that had the inscribed initials of LT was given to Emmitt. Emmitt arrived in Money, Mississippi the following day, which was August 21st, and he went to stay at his uncle's house. His uncle's name was Moses Wright. After being in Mississippi for a few days, Emmitt started to hang out with this group of teenagers. And this particular group on August 24th, 1955, had spent the day picking cotton in the hot afternoon sun. When they finished, they wanted to buy some refreshments, and so they went to a local grocery store to do so. The grocery store was Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market, and it was owned by a young white couple by the name of Roy and Carolyn Bryant. This grocery store was a small grocery store, and their clientele was mostly Black sharecroppers and their children. Carolyn Bryant was the daughter of a plantation owner and a nurse, and she came from Indianola, Mississippi. If you recall, that was the nucleus or the heart of the segregationist, supremacist movement, which was those white citizens' councils. She was a high school dropout, but she had won 2 beauty contests, and she married a former soldier by the name of Roy Bryant. So Emmitt went to the store with his friends to get some refreshments. He simply wanted to buy some bubble gum. On this evening of August 24th, 1955, when Emmitt goes to the store with his cousins and friends, he supposedly walked in and flirted with Carolyn Bryant. Some accounts will say that he touched her hand, that he whistled at her. Some others will say that he touched her waist. But really, there isn't an adequate account of what happened. It's all kind of different stories. Nonetheless, whatever happened, Carolyn Bryant storms out of the store. And some of the other kids that were on the scene said she stormed out of the store to go get a pistol. Well, that scared Emmitt and his cousins and friends, and so they left. Caroline had told her sister-in-law Juanita what had happened. Juanita happened to be in the back of the store with their children, and they both agreed not to tell their husbands. Now, their husbands were on a trucking job. Juanita's husband, J.W. Millam, happened to be Roy Bryant's half brother. And he was a rather big guy who liked to tell others that he knew how to handle blacks. Even though these women decided not to tell their husbands, one of the kids at the scene did tell their husbands. And both Roy and JW decided that what Emmitt had supposedly done crossed a line and he needed to be taught a lesson. So at about 2:30 a.m. on August 28th, these men showed up at Emmitt's uncle's house, right, the home of Moses Wright, and they took Emmitt. Wright said he saw a person in the car, possibly Carolyn, who helped identify Emmitt. After these men grabbed Emmitt, they had beaten him brutally. They took him to the edge of the Tallahatchie River. They shot him in the head. They fastened a large metal fan used for ginning cotton to his neck with barbed wire, and they pushed his body into the Tallahatchie River. On August 29th, both were arrested on kidnapping charges in Lafleur County with connection to Till's disappearance. They were jailed in Greenwood, Mississippi, and held without bond. On August 31st, 1955, the body of Emmitt Till, which happened to be decomposing, is pulled from Mississippi's Tallahatchie River. Moses Wright identified the body, and he was able to identify the body not by how it looked because it had been decomposing so badly, but by the ring that Emmitt had, the ring that his mother gave him the day before he left for Mississippi, his father's ring with the initials LT. On September 1st, Mississippi Governor Hugh White orders local officials to fully prosecute Milam and Bryant in Till's case. So on September 2nd, Mamie Till arrived at the Illinois Central Terminal to receive Emmitt's casket. The body was taken to AA and Sons Funeral Home. The Jackson Daily News, which was a paper from Mississippi, decried the brutal, senseless crime, but complained that the NAACP was working to arouse hatred and fear because they were calling Till's murder a lynching. Now, most people think of lynching as someone being hanged, and that is true. But the proper definition of lynching is that someone is killed by a mob, usually by being hanged, but it's for an offense that they may have committed and they're being killed without a trial. In addition to news in Mississippi, there also was a headline in Belgium. There was a newspaper called Le Drapeau Rouge, which means the red flag. And in it, they published a brief article entitled Racism in the USA, A Young Black is Lynched in Mississippi. So this event not only captivated the eyes of the nation, but of the world. On September 3rd, Emmitt Till's body was taken to Chicago Roberts Temple Church of God, and this is where his viewing and funeral services were held. Emmitt's mother decided to have an open casket funeral. Thousands of people actually waited outside of the funeral home to see Emmitt's brutally beaten body. So, why did she decide to have an open casket funeral after her son's body had been decomposing in the river for 3 days and he had been brutally beaten and shot in the head? Because she wanted people to see exactly what they did to her boy. She wanted the world to see what hatred looked like. Emmitt Till was buried on September 6th. In the middle of September, pictures of Emmitt Till's badly beaten body are going to be published in a variety of magazines. The first is Jet Magazine on September 15th. This was a nationwide Black magazine that happened to be owned by a Chicago-based publisher. And they published pictures of Till's mutilated corpse, which shocked and outraged African Americans across the country. On September 17th, the Black newspaper, the Chicago Defender, publishes photographs of Till's corpse as well. Bryant and Milam had already been rounded up as murder suspects, but there was Northern outrage that prompted many Southerners to resent outside agitators. They rallied in support of these men, and when it was found out that Bryant and Milam could not afford legal counsel, 5 local lawyers stepped up to represent the 2 suspects pro bono. This case takes place before the Miranda rights that you're familiar with when a suspect is arrested. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say will and can be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney. At this time in 1955, that was not a right. When the trial opened on September 19th, the national and international press descended on the scene. Jury selection began, and any Blacks and white women were banned from serving. So there was an all-white male jury made up of 9 farmers, 2 carpenters, and 1 insurance agent that was selected. Roy, Carolyn, and JW became celebrities. Some reporters talked about Roy and Carolyn's handsome looks and JW's tall stature, and he smoked these big cigars. During the trial, families arrived with their sons dressed in their Sunday best. Roy and JW appeared in these starched white shirts with their wives that donned cotton dresses next to them. Many whites in surrounding counties attended the trial as well. They brought their children picnic baskets and ice cream cones. Meanwhile, African American spectators were relegated to the back and they looked on in fear. Carolyn testified under oath, but outside the presence of the jury, that Emmitt said, ugly remarks to her before he whistled at her. Judge Curtis Swango recessed the court to allow for more witnesses to be found, and it was the first time in Mississippi history that local law enforcement, local NAACP leaders, and Black and white reporters teamed up to locate additional witnesses. They tried to locate sharecroppers who saw Millam's truck and overheard Emmitt being beaten. It's around this time that the French daily newspaper Le Monde, or The World, ran an article that reported the American public is following the Till case with passionate attention. On September 21st, Moses Wright, Emmitt's uncle, did the unthinkable. He accused two white men in open court. While he was on the witness stand, he stood up and pointed his finger at Millam and Bryant and accused them of coming into his home and kidnapping his nephew. On September 23rd, 1955, both Millam and Bryant were acquitted of murdering Emmitt Till after the jury deliberated for only 67 minutes. One juror told a reporter that they wouldn't have taken so long if they hadn't stopped to drink some pop. Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam stood before photographers. They lit up cigars. They kissed their wives in celebration of their not guilty verdict. Moses Wright and another poor Black Mississippian who testified by the name of Willie Reed, they left Mississippi and were smuggled into Chicago. Once there, Willie Reed was so nervous that he collapsed after suffering a nervous breakdown. As I said, international press appeared at this trial, and on September 26th, 3 days after the verdict was rendered, there were two left-wing newspapers from Belgium that published an article on the acquittal. La Pupille, the daily Belgian socialist newspaper, called the acquittal a judicial scandal in the United States. Le Drapeau Rouge, which is that red flag newspaper I referenced earlier, published an article with a headline that said, killing a Black person isn't a crime in the United States of America. It isn't a crime in the home of the Yankees. The white killers of young Emmitt Till are acquitted. Another French newspaper publishes the scandalous acquittal in Sumner, and the daily newspaper Le Figaro adds the shame of the Sumner jury. The next day, the French newspaper Le Monde ran an article, "The Sumner trial marks perhaps an opening of the consciousness." And on September 28th, a German newspaper, Fries Volk, published, "The life of a Negro isn't worth a whistle." Despite these two men being acquitted on the murder charges, there were still kidnapping charges that were pending. So on September 30th, Millam and Bryant were released on bond. On October 15th, the Memphis Commercial Appeal published an article reporting that Louis Till was executed by the U.S. Army in Italy in 1945 for raping two Italian women and killing a third. This information was classified and was leaked by the Mississippi Senator James Eastland. On October 22nd, the American Jewish Committee in New York released a report urging Congress to bolster federal civil rights legislation in light of the Till case. And the report included quotes from all of those newspapers around the world that I just mentioned. Congress was able to see that all of those newspapers expressed shock and outrage after Till's verdict. On November 9th, 1955, Moses Wright and Willie Reed returned to Mississippi to testify just one more time, and the grand jury refused to indict Millam or Bryant on the kidnapping charges, and the two men went free again. When they were acquitted, the two men sold their story for $4,000 to a reporter. Two of their defense attorneys helped facilitate the interview, and it was published in Look magazine in January of 1956. After the town's show of support at the trial, the men talked freely about how they killed the young teen from Chicago. But soon after the article came out, the men were ostracized. Blacks stopped frequenting the groceries owned by both Bryant and Millam. Their stores soon went out of business. They were unable to find work, and Roy took his family to East Texas and attended welding school. His half brother JW followed him soon after, but years later, both men would eventually return to Mississippi. In 1994, one of their defense attorneys, John Whitten, told National Public Radio's Soundprint program that he later regretted defending the case. He said, "I'm not proud of it. I wish I had never been associated with it." Roy Bryant was also interviewed for the same Soundprint program. Legally blind and plagued with back trouble, he refused to talk about the case. Even though he was protected by double jeopardy, he still feared that he would have to pay for his crime before he died. The only thing that he did say was, "Let that goddamn stuff die. Look what they done with Beckwith, and now they want to get to me. Well, to hell with them. I'm not going to talk about it. Can't ever tell what they might do nowadays. They might change the Constitution." When he was referring to Beckwith, he was talking about white supremacist Byron de la Beckwith, who was convicted in 1994 of murdering, assassinating Black NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers. Embittered, Roy also claimed that his half brother, JW, got all of the money from the Look deal. "A lot of people made a bunch of money off this. I ain't never made a damn nickel," is another quote that he gave. In 1981, Millam had died of cancer. And in August of 1994, shortly after this interview with Soundprint, Roy Bryant died of cancer as well. No one ever did time for Emmett Till's murder. Before Emmett Till ever stepped foot in Mississippi, there were African Americans across the country, including in the segregated South, that had begun to struggle for justice. Emmett Till's murder was a spark in the upsurge of activism and resistance that became known as the Civil Rights Movement. The sight of his brutalized body pushed many who had been content to stay on the sidelines, it pushed them into action. Emmett Till's death had a powerful effect on Mississippi civil rights. Medgar Evers, who was the NAACP field officer in Jackson, Mississippi, urged the NAACP national leadership to get involved. Governmental leaders were going to be publicly chastised, specifically FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. One civil rights leader said, "It's getting to be a strange thing that the FBI can never seem to work out who's responsible for the death of Negroes in the South." In December of 1955, the Black magazine Ebony had reported that several civil rights leaders were actually on a list called the Death List of the Ku Klux Klan. But probably the most important impact of Emmett Till's death was that it gave momentum to the civil rights movement. Just 100 days after Emmett Till was murdered, a Black woman by the name of Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery city bus, and she was arrested for violating Alabama's segregation laws. The Women's Democratic Council under Joanne Robinson called for a citywide bus boycott, and they asked a young 26-year-old minister to help. His name was Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.